Okay, I hope you guys had the opportunity to walk around, stretch your legs, go to the bathroom, get some food, whatever you needed. Joanne and I both really appreciate that it's hard to sit on Zoom for long periods of time, and I appreciate, Claudette, your request for a little bit more of a break. So we'll keep that in mind as we design our future meetings for sure. So if you're looking at your meeting design, we are at our 12:35 slot. And we're moving into our conversation on trust and the connection between trust and leadership and change. So for our 12:35 slot, we have a 6-step process, time permitting. So I'm going to start by sharing some content and doing some teaching around what we call the 3 dimensions of trust, which is probably familiar, Sarah and Claudette, to you from your experience at SIA. You're going to have the opportunity then to have a conversation in pairs, and we're going to use the Zoom functionality to put you in some buddy pairs. So Joanne's going to be our Zoom maestro for this section of the design. Then we'll come back and have a full group conversation to hear what parts of your conversation as buddies. Then you'll go back into a new set of buddy pairs and have some more dialogue. Come back and share with the full group. And then if we have time, we'll have some dialogue to deepen our understanding around the 3 dimensions of trust model. So this is a 30-minute slot and beginning our conversation on trust. Any thoughts or questions about the next 30 minutes and our process before we start? Joanne, anything you want to say about Zoom buddying before we dive in?
Yeah, just you've been randomly put into your breakout rooms, and apparently Zoom automatically like puts you in the breakout room and takes you out, so you don't have to touch anything. This is the first time I'm driving this, so we'll just give it a try. Thanks, Jim.
Okay, you bet. All right, and I'm going to share my screen again. So, and I hate that I can't see everybody when I do that. It makes me nuts. But oh well, we'll figure that out for another time. So this is our conversation on leadership, trust, and change. For some reason, the slide's not advancing.
Oh, did you have it on pause?
No, it's on. No.
I learned this past week. So unless you're in webinar functionality in Zoom, you have to like go through sort of your presenter mode of a PowerPoint. So you're showing everything on the side. It won't allow you to advance unless it's in a webinar feature on Zoom. I don't know if that's the issue.
Oh, okay. I was able to do it earlier, but I'll have to use my clicker. Thanks, Suzanne. All right, so today's conversation on trust. We use the iceberg metaphor to start this conversation for a couple of reasons. The first is that this particular conversation on trust is meant to be the tip of the iceberg. You could study trust. We could all study trust for a lifetime. There is a ton of literature and research that's been done on it. It's a deep and complicated topic. So today we're going to really just get into the tip of the iceberg. The second reason that we use this metaphor is that our experience with trust, it's similar to the conversation that we were just having about system, that often trust is something that's invisible to us. In the iceberg there, the iceberg extends, as we know, far into the water, and the reach of it is often invisible to us. Trust is something like that as well. It's often running and existing under the surface in our relationships and our work. And we can be more impactful. We can lead change more effectively if we can bring the elements of trust that are under the iceberg and make them both visible and conscious. So leading and working with others, these are some of the typical responses that we often get. So accountability, manage expectations, clear communication, willingness to learn. Very similar in some ways to the responses that you shared earlier as well. One of the things that we know that is central to leading and working with others, and that we being Joanne and I and Strelo really believe is at the heart of managing and leading complex change, is trust. So we're going to talk a little bit about just some table setting ideas about trust. The first is that at its core, trust is really about risk. All studies that have looked at risk or trust have substantiated the idea that trust is about risk. Trusting is a vulnerable act. I have something to lose by trusting. That could be my money, it could be my reputation, it could be time, it could be feelings or my sense of self-worth. You know, what is at stake will really depend on the relationship and the circumstances. The second is that we are each wired to approach risk and trust differently. Some of us are more natural risk takers. Some of us are more naturally cautious. For those of us who have parents, you can see this difference in kids who are born into the same family from the same parents. It's this orientation to trust and risk being different is likely a combination of both nature and nurture. We come into the world with an ingrained orientation to risk, and then we're influenced by the systems and the cultures and the experiences that we have as individuals. The third point we want to make about trust, and I love this phrase, is that trust is a manageable act of faith, which means that it is a choice that we get to make, to trust in another person, to trust in a relationship, to trust in an organization, or to trust in a system. And trust can be more easily built and rebuilt when we make it concrete. So again, it's kind of an amorphous concept. Much of what we know and experience about trust lives under the surface. And to the extent that we can make it concrete and that we can make it something that we can see and understand, we increase our ability to consciously manage trust, which helps us from the perspective of leading others and navigating complex change. So it's on this point about making trust concrete that we're going to spend our time in this conversation. So this is the 3 dimensions of trust. This is the model that we use within Strelo to make trust more concrete. In the pre-reading that you did, there were, I think, 10 factors that were part of that research around what influences trust. In our model, we're simplifying that down to 3 because we find them to be, number 1, the most powerful, and number 2, they are all encompassing and really give us a simplified yet concrete and impactful way of beginning to build, repair trust. So I want to talk through each of the dimensions, and the first is benevolence. So we define benevolence as having someone else's best interest at heart. Benevolence means that I have to care about what's good for you as much or more as I care about what's good for me. And I have to be willing to lead in such a way that you can see and feel my benevolence. Sometimes benevolence can be kind of a hard word to internalize, and it's not one that's used as often in our culture. And having someone else's best interest at heart can feel a little bit difficult for people to grasp. When I've talked about this with my kids, the analogy I use is like when someone has your back, right? When somebody else has your back, that is a sign that you are in a benevolent relationship. The second dimension of trust is competence, and we define this as I am capable of doing what I say I can do. So competence is about skills, it's about competencies, it's about knowledge, it's about technical expertise and depth of expertise. It reflects my ability as an individual to use all of those things to deliver on results. The third dimension of trust is reliability, and we define this as I will follow through on what I promise. So reliability is about doing what you say you will do and doing that consistently. When our behaviors are not predictable or when our behavior is erratic, that erodes trust. In some of the literature that I've read, and in the pre-reading that you read also, integrity is combined with the dimension of predictability. And when we think about what integrity means in Joanne and Mai's working world, it means to be whole and complete with your word. It means you follow through on your actions. So when we think about being in integrity, we connect that to the dimension of trust, of reliability, because when we are reliable, we do what we say that we will do. A couple of other points to make about the 3 dimensions. So they're all very different things, but they often get conflated together in the concept of trust. They also pull on each other. So at times, one or more of these dimensions can be more important than another. And our overall level of trust in an individual or in a relationship is only as strong as the weakest dimension. So if I have high trust in someone's competence and I have high trust in their reliability, but I question their benevolence, the trust level in our relationship is only as high as the trust that I feel in their benevolence or that they feel in mine. When we're in the process of rebuilding trust, it requires us to determine which dimension of trust is most degraded. And it's only from there, from that dimension, that we can rebuild and restore trust. So for example, in that same example, if benevolence in a relationship has been breached, there's no amount of competence or reliability that's going to compensate for that lack of benevolence in the relationship. I'm going to pause just for a second and ask if there are thoughts or questions about the 3 dimensions. And do they make sense to you as different yet related components of trust? Claudette's nodding her head. I can't see Suzanne because of my screen share. Okay. All right, so we're going to keep going. So 2 truisms about trust. And it takes a little while to wrap your mind around these. So number 1, we all want to believe that we are trustworthy, even though, ironically, we struggle to trust others. Number 2, believing we are trustworthy and being perceived by others as trustworthy are 2 different things. So we all like to believe that we're trustworthy, even though, ironically, we struggle to trust others. So that's a paradox, where I believe I'm trustworthy, but you're not trustworthy. The second is a little bit more challenging. So generally speaking, we believe ourselves to be trustworthy. So I see myself as a trustworthy person. Cody sees herself as trustworthy. But believing that we're trustworthy and being perceived that way by somebody else, those are 2 different things. And it's because of that distinction between perceiving myself as trustworthy and being perceived as trustworthy that we need to return to our foundation of self, other, and system as we talk about trust. So if leadership starts with self, that's kind of our mantra in Strelo, leadership starts with self. You know, we must lead ourselves before we can lead others and engage the system to create change. That same concept applies in the context of assessing, building, and rebuilding trust. So if we're talking about leading ourselves and we're talking about trust, you know, what does it mean to lead ourselves in the context of trust? So leading self is about being trustworthy. Okay, we're defining being trustworthy as deserving of trust or competence. So to lead ourselves, we have to have the self-awareness to consciously choose behaviors that generate trust. So as a leader and as a leader of change, that means that I'm first aware of my behaviors, right? That I have enough self-awareness that I know what they are, right? And then I'm assessing my relationships and I'm consciously choosing behaviors in each dimension, benevolence, competence, and reliability, that I believe will build greater trust. And if I'm doing that, I likely perceive myself as trustworthy. So then returning to the truism that we perceive ourselves as trustworthy, but we also need others to perceive us that way. I need those I lead to perceive me as trustworthy. So what that means is that I have to be able to take perspective, right? It means that I have to be able to see and understand my behavior from their perspective. So I'm looking at myself and then I'm looking at myself from the perspective of someone else. So for example, if I'm in a relationship with Sarah, I need to consciously choose behaviors that I believe will generate trust with Sarah. When I do this, I see myself as trustworthy. And I need Sarah to see and perceive those behaviors in the same way. And if I feel there's an erosion of trust in this relationship, before I point the fingers at Sarah and say, well, it's Sarah's responsibility, Sarah isn't trustworthy, I have to first examine myself and ask myself, am I being trustworthy from my perspective, from the perspective of leading self? But am I also being trustworthy from the perspective of Sarah? I have to try on her experience with me as a leader. Then we shift to leading others. So leading others, we say starting from a place of trust. So as we talk about leading ourselves, we've talked about putting ourselves in the shoes of those we lead and perceiving our own trustworthiness from their perspective. but to lead others, we also need to be trusting of them. So we want them, the people that we lead, to see, feel, and hear that we're starting from a place of trust. And this trust is required for them to engage with us and change. So one of my kind of massive revelations as a leader is that I had to love the thing that I was trying to change, right? It had to feel my love and my benevolence. It being people, stakeholders, the system, right? Like this giant company called Micron Technology with 37,000 people around the world that I was trying to create massive cultural change, right? It had to see, feel, and hear that I was trusting of all of the people within that system in order to change. There will be times when we have insufficient trust in someone else, in another. And it's in that situation, after we've first examined our own behaviors from the perspective of leading self, we've done some perspective taking of what is it, how does our behavior look from their perspective? Then we can also begin to diagnose on which dimension of trust has been breached for us in another person's behavior. But we're advocating that as a leader, that's not your starting place, right? The starting place is self-examination, right? Leadership starts with self, then perspective taking, looking at your behaviors from the perspective of another person, and then looking at the behavior of the other person. Okay, a few final thoughts. I want to make sure I know where I am in the design. Okay. So trust is something that I wouldn't consider it at a point in time, right? It should be considered as an evolution throughout time. It's something that we build over time as we are in relationship with people. It's also a feedback loop that allows us to continually assess, build, and rebuild where needed. So when we can begin to make the distinction between the three dimensions of trust, when we have that feeling of that trust is being degraded in a relationship, when we can be clear and distinct between the difference between benevolence, competence, and reliability, it guides and anchors our own thinking, and it allows us to begin to build and repair trust in our relationships. So I'm going to pause and ask for thoughts or questions before we do put you quickly in your breakout groups. Any thoughts or questions?
An observation.
Oh, go ahead.
I want to make an observation, which is I was really struck at how much of this came out in our initial reflections on leading self and leading others. I'm just like really struck by that.
Cody?
I was going through this, you kind of play out some of your relationships within your professional life and personal life, and immediately I can kind of pick up on, where I might be lacking reliability or benevolence or competence in myself and in others. So it's interesting to take a step back and actually reflect on that.
Perfect, which is an excellent segue. All right, so Joanne's going to put you in breakout groups. Before she does, in your pair, you're going to discuss this question, which is in your meeting design also. How does this framework help me better understand myself? So you'll have about 5 minutes, and then we're going to ask you to come back to the full group, and you're going to share 2 ideas from your small group conversation with our larger group. So with that, I'm going to let Joanne do the Zoom Maestro.
Yeah, I think the way this is supposed to work is it'll automatically put you in your breakout groups and it'll automatically bring you back. So, and it'll give you a little countdown clock and it'll tell you when all this is supposed to happen. So,
Okay, cool.
all right.
Okay, so we're the only ones back.
Maybe everybody's getting kicked off immediately. Who knows? Oh, there we go. Here's Joanne.
It's all a mystery to me how it actually works.
So we clicked leave, breakout room, return to session.
Oh, you did?
Okay, I did too.
that authority to do
It
that.
worked. Yay. Okay. Now, and I need to reshare my screen. Is that correct?
Like, yep.
Okay. All right. Let me reshare. Okay. So now what we'd like to do is here. Oh, somehow. There you go. Hear from each of your groups. So, Sarah and Suzanne, would you like to go first? What are
Sure.
you guys?
Yeah, so I wrote down some notes for us.
Great.
I think first and foremost, as we go through this process, I think it helps us think about our own initial reactions. That usually when there is a conflict or an area of mistrust, your first thought is always, well, I'm doing everything right. Why are you messing up? Why are you not trustworthy? And we don't consider always what we've done maybe to contribute to that situation. So reflecting on our own behaviors and skills that led to trust or didn't, as may be the case. And then just ability to take a wider perspective on what's influencing somebody's choices, that it may not be just about us or even the work environment, that they've got family histories and other personal lives that may affect their behavior and influence their ability to trust and interact, et cetera, et cetera.
Got it. Okay. Excellent. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Cody or Claudette?
So I took the notes for Claudette and I, and Claudette, and correct me if I misinterpret this, Claudette, but she was really saying, you know, that the self-reflection of, you know, reliability and procrastination, how we can see this reliability within ourselves, and, you know, are we getting things done at the appropriate amount of time that we're also requiring, you know, our colleagues to do. So really having that like personal self-reflection. And then I was really, when I was looking,
ask a clarifying question because I want to make sure I'm capturing this. So the reflection is around, or specifically around the dimension of reliability, and the insight is, am I applying the same expectations of reliability to myself that I expect of others? Is that what I'm hearing? Claudette,
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and also, you know, that's a common theme. People say, "Oh, I'm just a procrastinator," or they start a project at home and they don't finish it, and then it kind of breaks down the whole wheel because you don't trust yourself to follow through and finish those projects.
Yeah, so when we miss commitments that we make to ourselves, it erodes our own sense of self-trust.
Yes, that's what I meant, right, exactly. You said it exactly how I was thinking. When you make those commitments or promises to yourself and you break them, then that breaks down the reliability piece.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, great.
And then I feel like originally you would do this activity and then you would just say, oh, well, I'm a trustworthy, you know, this is where my one main weakness is, and apply it to all life. But really you have to look at this model and do it for everything. Because like, I know for me personally, there are times where I don't have the confidence to trust myself in moving forward with a certain activity, or you know, looking at a scenario and saying, do I really have other people's best interests at heart, or am I being very self-serving in what I'm searching for, and how it's just different, you know? Great.
That's a good insight. Yep. Awesome. So that it's situational, right? The application is situational. We might want to think we show up the same way all the time, but the reality is we don't. Yeah. Awesome. Great. So what we're going to do next is Joanne's going to put you back in breakout groups, new groups. And then the question that we would like you to discuss this time is, how does this framework help me better understand my relationship with others? So we've taken the opportunity to look and reflect on self, because leadership starts with self. And now we're looking at using the 3 dimensions of trust, and how does it help us in our relationships with others?
It's 4 minutes.
Same process, other than we're going to go for 4 minutes because we're a skosh behind time.
Hello, everyone.
Yay.
Hello.
Yay. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. All right. How does this framework help me understand my relationship with others? Which pair would like to share? Who'd like to go first?
Sarah and I can
Okay.
talk about ours.
Awesome.
So Sarah and I talked about how this framework allows you to pinpoint where that trust might be lost. And it almost can act as like a conversation starter to identify accountability and clarity around those next steps, or if there are next steps. You know, Sarah brought up a good example of, you know, if you feel like in some type of business opportunity that your best interest isn't being taken at heart, and it's like a business proposal of 2 organizations, then you can state that, and maybe the other organization's like, oh no, that's not what we're trying to do, and kind of opens up a new dialogue.
Great. That's awesome. Thank you. What was your second, Cody?
It was both of those, so I guess they kind of
Okay.
tied into each other.
Awesome. Thank you. Suzanne and Claudette?
So I think we were kind of all over the place, right? About a lot of things. Suzanne, I know you talked about, you see your daughter, she's a perfectionist and may have gotten it from you. And I was talking about how my daughter struggles with how she's being conditioned with her teachers in school and the expectations they have. And, you know, how do you get all that work done in a shorter amount of time? Do you do it 100%, or do you try to BS as much as you can to get it in for getting grades, you know? So if you, in terms of perfectionists trying to get it perfectly done, it's very hard to do that when you're in school. And so you are harder on yourself than you are on others. Oh, and that's the first thing I was talking about is, so perfectionism. And then I talk about some people have a higher standard for others than they do for themselves. And then some people have a higher standard for themselves than they do for others. And so it's dependent on, you know, the person's expectations and can you meet those expectations? And then we talked about one piece of the COVID crisis that's going on right now, and that breakdown of benevolence, you know, in terms of throughout all of this crisis, we're still expected to, you know, work. So is that taking everybody's best interest at heart?
Got it. And on the first piece around perfectionism and how we often impose that on ourselves, which I have lived that myself, connect that to trust. Connect that to the conversation you were having around trust. How does it impact either our self-trust or, in this question, our ability to understand our relationship with others?
I guess I could maybe respond to that, and just thinking that, like, a big part of, I think, working with others too and trusting is sort of like that, maybe even delegation can be a good example of, like, allowing a team member to do a task or a project, but perfectionism either gets in sort of like the management perspective or your way. So I guess like delegation's a good example that I see in my own life.
Okay. And so maybe the model then can help in the sense that you can use it to articulate your expectations, right? What would it take for you to trust enough to be able to delegate, right? And to think about what does it mean in the context of that particular piece of work or that relationship across benevolence, competence and reliability, what's expected in those dimensions, use that as a conversation, a framework for a conversation to create the condition of trust so that you feel more comfortable delegating.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Awesome. Joanne, any reflections or observations that you want to offer about responses to this question?
I think my main observation is how much clarity, like how much more sort of acute you can sort of pinpoint the nature of the problem when you have a framework like this.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to use that as an opportunity to segue, particularly on this topic of benevolence. So we are a couple minutes behind time. We're at our 1:05 slot and it's 1:15, doing a deeper dive on benevolence. So I'm going to challenge myself to go sort of quickly through the benevolence topic. And let me go back to sharing my screen. Part of why I feel like we can do that is in the way that we've created the container for this experience already, and your expectations for yourselves and for each other, you've already begun to demonstrate the skills that are required to begin to build benevolent relationships. So one of the reasons why that we do spend some time diving into benevolence of the 3 dimensions is that it's typically where there's the most work for us to do. It's easier to be reliable often. It's easier to perform in the competence dimension, but sometimes benevolence is most challenging. When benevolence is damaged in a relationship, it is also the most difficult to recover from, right? So we think it's important to spend some time really digging into what are the skills required for us to truly generate benevolence in our relationships and to ensure our own trustworthiness. Let me back up. And there's 3 skills that we have that we're looking at, or competencies, as we think about what do we need in order to build benevolent relationships. You've already begun to talk about all 3 of these and really touch on them in our conversation. So the first is connection, the second is empathy, and the third is curiosity. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time, in the interest of speeding us up, I'm going to go pretty quickly. So the first is connection. And for those of you who are familiar with Brené Brown, both Joanne and I are very large fans of her work, and she works in this space a lot. And so we're going to be borrowing some of Brené's ideas as we talk about connection and empathy. So she defines connection as the energy that exists between people when they feel seen, heard, and valued, when they can give and receive without judgment, when they derive sustenance, and I love that word in this context, sustenance, and strength from the relationship. Joanne, as a biologist, would also tell you that we are wired for connection, and it is what defines us as a species. I think the important thing to know about using connection as a skill to build benevolence in your relationships is that it is built over time. It's an iterative process. I like seeing your daughter pop in, Claudette, I'm not sure who that was, but it's built over time, it's iterative, and it comes from small gestures, right? So it is not the active heroics. It's not staying up till 2 in the morning to finish the deliverable. It's small little things that we do for each other that allow someone else to feel seen, heard, and cared for. In my own work as a leader, I have found that gratitude and small expressions of appreciation are one of the most powerful ways to build connection with another person. The second skill is that of empathy. And again, we rely on Brené's work, and we want to talk about what empathy is and what it is not. So we define it as feeling with, not feeling for. And Brené says empathy isn't connecting to an experience. Empathy is connecting to the emotions that underpin that experience. So we have this saying in our culture, walk a mile in someone's shoes. That's really not what it's about. It's not about replicating their experience. It's about being curious and connecting to the emotion of the experience. So what did it feel like to walk that mile, right? What were the emotional highs and lows of that experience? So it's not replicating it, but it's really connecting to the emotional undertone and the feelings that are present for someone else. The other thing that Brene says, and I think this is really important, is that empathy is not sympathy, right? So it's not about feeling sorry for someone. It is about being able to relate to their emotions. And there's an excellent video that she has that I'd like for us to send, if you haven't watched it, on how she defines empathy and the difference that it is from sympathy. Because sympathy actually can begin to destroy connection. So in our attempt to create connection with others, if we move accidentally into sympathy versus empathy, it's disempowering to somebody else, and it also has the potential to begin to destroy connection. There's a set of skills that are required in order to build empathy, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking about each of them. The first is seeing the world from someone's perspective. And you guys have already demonstrated this again in the conversation that we've been having. And in fact, as you were sharing back, I think Cody, in your breakout group around the skill, how does the framework of trust help you lead yourself? You talked about taking a broader view of somebody else's experience, and that's what this is, right? So we tend to be really fixed in our own worldviews, and we have to be willing to see the world from someone else's perspective. We have to be willing to be the student and be willing to let go of being right or knowing it all. The second skill is being non-judgmental. So we tend to judge people in areas where they're doing worse than we would do. We also tend to judge, and I think this really speaks to the importance of self-awareness, particularly in leadership, but we judge where we have wounds. And when we're doing that and it's unconscious to us, it's incredibly damaging to relationships. So in order to truly empathize, we have to be non-judgmental. My mom used to tell me when I was a kid, I would complain about somebody else. She would say, the thing that bothers us most in others are the things that we like least in ourselves. So it's really important, I think, just to have some self-awareness and to truly be non-judgmental when you're in the act of empathizing with somebody else. The third skill is identify and communicate an understanding of their feelings. So this requires a couple of things. It requires that we have language around feelings, that we have emotional literacy and words that allow us to name feelings, both in ourselves and in someone else. And we need to be able to do that and then reflect back to somebody else what they're feeling. And the fourth skill is being mindful and paying attention. So taking a balanced approach to emotions so that we're creating this space for somebody else to feel what's true and right for them. And we're not either overreacting or underreacting to their emotions. And we're also not over-identifying with it. So if their emotions are triggering something in us and we're over-identifying with their emotion, that actually has, again, the opposite effect of breaking connection, and we have an empathy miss, as Brene would call it. So those are the 4 skills for empathy, which is our second competence for building benevolent relationships. And the third competency in building benevolent relationships, and again, you guys have naturally already really touched on this, is curiosity. And Joanne and I define curiosity as a desire to close the gap between what we know and what we don't. And how we can demonstrate curiosity is really to be a learner and not a knower, and to ask a lot of questions. When I find myself, and it happens regularly, feeling the need to be right, feeling the need to know, feeling the need to have the perfect answer, particularly if I'm working with a client, there's a set of questions that help me really ground myself in curiosity, right? The story I make up is, right? If I'm starting to doubt someone's benevolence, I'm probably telling myself a story about what's going on. So that allows me to very sort of benevolently share with somebody else what I might be experiencing, and to really test that with them. I'm curious about, tell me more. How does this compare to your experience? Walk me through. So our suggestion is that when you find yourself feeling the need to know, feeling the need to be right, that you can engage and build your muscle of curiosity by starting with a set of questions that you use. And what I also find, it just started pouring rain in Idaho. What I also find is that even when I'm starting, if I'm using questions, when I'm starting to think that I know, if I go just one step deeper, ask one more question and stay in curiosity a little bit longer, the quality of the relationship, the quality of the information is always improved. So I'm going to pop back out too, and these are, again, the 3 dimensions and the 3 competencies that help us to begin to build benevolent relationships. We start with benevolence because it is, in much of the research, the most important component for building trust, and also where we are often challenged as individuals. And we can begin to build benevolence by practicing connection, empathy, and curiosity. So what I'd like to do now is silent reflection, thinking about benevolence and thinking about the competencies that help us to build benevolent relationships. What new behavior would be a game changer for you? So just take a few minutes and spend some time thinking about that. And you can do a couple of behaviors. Doesn't have to be just one. And then we'll take a moment to share back with the full group. Okay, in the spirit of time, I'm going to go ahead and have us go ahead and get started. So who'd like to go first? What's one behavior that for you would be a game changer?
I could start. This one was pretty easy for me because it's something I've been working on. I'm sure I need to work on all 3, but the curiosity piece is just culturally not something that I was taught to do. You don't tell your business and people don't you don't ask people their business. Mm-hmm. So I'm really working on that piece.
Thanks, Claudette. And I appreciate your sharing for you where that comes from. That's really helpful. Thank you. Who's next?
Mine was, I'll jump in. I had being more curious. I feel like out of all 3 aspects of the trust framework, benevolence is the area that I need to develop the most. And really just taking a step and before jumping in to say, well, here's what I think, really asking one more question of why. Like, why are you answering that way? Explain a little further more to me. So
great. Thank you, Cody. Oh, I see a visitor, Suzanne. Cute. All right, Sarah or Suzanne?
I can go next. So new behavior for me would, I think, be less or more, I guess just say more mindful or balanced to my emotional response. My husband has a saying where he tells me to stop making that face so loud. I tend to kind of wear all of my feelings, like even if I'm not saying it, I'm expressing it on my face. So it's something I am also working on.
Great. And Sarah, can you say a little bit more about how you think that's helpful in the context of trust?
Yeah, definitely. So in terms of, I mean, specifically when we're talking about benevolence and trust, I think it's helpful for me to not always take that take that train to a big emotional swell, like that initial reaction, like say somebody says something or does something that's upsetting to you, and you immediately want to go to that place of like anger or frustration or I am right and you're wrong or vindication of some kind. So instead of taking that train and wearing it on my face, I want to just like be a little more Zen. If I could be a little more Buddha-like, that'd be great.
Great. And I'm capturing that, and tell me if this feels true for you, but that it helps with being non-judgmental.
Yeah. Oh, the two were very tied together for sure.
That's what I'm hearing as you're talking. Awesome.
Yeah.
Suzanne.
Okay. So I think, sorry, I'm a little distracted right now with
Okay.
a new visitor that's joined me. I think for me, it's sort of a balance both between curiosity and then and paying attention. Both those two to deepen my skills there. I think I have a tendency to sort of, want to rush ahead and not really pay attention to the moment and be mindful and kind of build. I think that builds into the benevolence skill set. So if that makes sense, sorry.
Totally. Yeah, it does. Because we have to pause, right? We have to be willing to stop and take time in order to build benevolence in our relationships. And some of us are wired to just keep moving, right? So when there's an opportunity presents itself to create connection with somebody, unless we stop and take that moment, it's gone, right? And so it's that rushing, right, that we have to be mindful of. I totally get it. Thank you guys for sharing all of those. We look forward to being with you as you continue to grow your skills and curiosity and the other dimensions of benevolence. So in the interest of time, I think we did okay. We're at the end of that slot. We're at our 1:30 item, and we're going to spend a little bit of time just connecting the dots between trust and change. So the first thing I want to do is return to the 3 dimensions. So we've talked about benevolence, competence, and reliability as being foundational to assessing, building, and rebuilding trust. We've talked about trust and leading with self and trusting others, right? So that connection between self, other, and system. But I also want to talk a little bit about that connection between head, heart, and hand and the 3 dimensions. And maybe it's easy to see. And I'll ask before I tell, like, what connections do you see between head, heart, and hand and the 3 dimensions of trust? Anybody see an immediate connection, Sarah?
It's a thinking, doing, and feeling. So head is thinking, heart is feeling, hand is like that action, that need to like respond immediately. And so, I mean, I know they don't exactly line up, but I think there's some very obvious intersections about how we can build those 3 buckets of skills, using those and like finding that sweet spot in the middle of all of those. So you're not too heavily leaning on the thinking into like indecisiveville. You're not too heavy-handed, pun intended, with the doing, and you're not too feeling and like overreacting emotionally. You've got a nice balance of all 3.
Yeah, awesome. Anybody else have thoughts on connections?
Suzanne had her hand up.
Suzanne?
Yeah, I guess when we were first doing this, when you were introducing this after the iceberg analogy, I was just thinking benevolence is the heart, the competence was hand, and reliability was mind for me. So that's what I sketched out.
Yeah, awesome. Great. I love that you saw that. Yeah, so benevolence is about heart, right? It's about having someone's best interest at heart. It's about using our skills of empathy and connection and curiosity, which really are about, heart-to-heart connection. Competence is largely about head, skills, knowledge, depth of experience, and helping others know that we're capable of doing what we say we can do. And reliability is about hand, right? It's about follow through, doing what you promise, delivering results that build trust in your relationships. So when we build trust in the 3 dimensions, we're more readily able to engage our whole selves, right? This is true for us and building self-trust. It's also true for other people. So when we build trusting relationships with others, and specifically with those that we lead, we're more able to engage their whole self. So with that, I'm going to segue and talk a little bit about kind of bringing all of this together. You know, this experience is in the context of building skills for all of us that help us to lead complex change and change the world in the ways that we want to. And so these are some thoughts. There's certainly other insights that I know you'll have and share with us as a group. But what makes trust essential to change? The first for me is that all systems are comprised of people, right? Our stakeholders. So it's easy to get pissed at the system. It's easy to think that it's this thing that exists that we can't influence or control. But the reality is that systems are comprised of people. They're made up of people's thinking and ideas and processes. And so if we can connect to them from the perspective of them being people and stakeholders, I think that's helpful. The second is that when trust is present in a relationship, more is possible, really more of everything, right? We can work at a greater pace and speed than we could otherwise. We can generate new innovative ideas, right? More is simply possible when we have trust in a relationship. The third thing that I know to be true about change and all of the change work that I've done, and I'm trained in, I'm trained in really traditional methods of change management, and I've used them, and then I've also led change in the way that Joanne and I are teaching each of you, is that change with is more effective than change to. The working world is full of adults who are who have agency, who get to operate as adults in all aspects of their life, outside of often their organizations. And when we can engage with them in change, and a change with mentality, we recognize their agency, right? We recognize their whole self. They feel trusted, and they are much more likely to join in whatever is the change that we're leading, which is really connected to the fourth point, which is trust is a precondition for helping someone or something to change. I had a moment as I was getting ready in my previous life of leading work, some really large scale change at Micron, and I was taking a walk with a friend and totally complaining about the organization, the culture. And he's a coach, and he can be really direct. And he just said, Shannon, when are you gonna get it, right? That you are Micron, right? They're not separate from you. You're not separate from them. Like, you are them. And which was a total aha for me. And the minute that I was able to internalize that message and start showing up in a way in the organization from a place of benevolence, and to begin to build stronger, more trusting relationships, the change that I was there to lead and to create began to happen. So for me, trust, and particularly the condition of benevolence, is a precondition for helping someone or something, an organization, a system, to change. So with that, we have 2 minutes for thoughts or questions or reflections before we bring this particular conversation on trust to a close.
I don't know why the analogy of like monkey see, monkey do jumped into my head when you were talking about that, but it's really like people will follow if they see what you're doing. So if you put this framework into practice, then, the hope is that it kind of diffuses throughout the entire organization. So yeah, that's what I thought.
Totally, Cody. And I think of that as leading self, right? We have to show up in a way that's the same that we expect of the change we're trying to create, right? Thank you. Other thoughts or reflections? Okay. All right, Joanne, we're successfully back on time.
That was awesome.
We're at our 1:40 slot, and it's your job to talk about next steps.
Good. So I'm going to grab the screen share back.
Yep.
And I'm going to share the correct screen because I've got 3 in front of me. All right. So we're back on the meeting plan. We are at the 140 item. I'm going to tee up some next steps. So if you are seeing my screen, I'm going to do 4 things. I'm going to just do a quick overview of our folder system. So when you hit this link, or if you go to the one on the top of the document that says parent folder, it essentially will take you to a Google folder that has a bunch of subfolders in it. And in this folder, we hope to keep things nice and tidy. So all the meeting plans for your buddy calls will live in a buddy call folder. All your work for your buddy calls will also live in that folder. I believe that these things are supposed to be magically converted to MP4 movies. So the movies from all of the calls, so you can have them forever and ever and ever, will live in this folder. Worksheets and exercises. So this entire class will have pretty much everything will sort of fit into these subfolders. So I just wanted to share that with you. Second thing is, so now coming out of this, and next week, you have some pre-work for the buddy call. And essentially it breaks down to the 2 things that we talked about, foundations and trust. And so the pre-work is to begin to wear your goggles of self, other, and system and begin to look at the world through those lenses. And so for each of you to identify a situation in your world in which you can practice using self, other, system as a framework for deepening your understanding and awareness, and as Shannon said, seeing the system. So jot down any observations that you have about each level. I do this all the time when I listen to the news, like whether it's about climate change or anti-vax or COVID or whatever. Like it's a really interesting, just a way to sort of navigate complexity in your world. Add any, and especially if you're doing this for the first time, you know, add any insights that you may have and bring your thoughts and analyses to share with your buddy at your buddy meeting. And then for trust, again, identify a real, because we try not to do pretend work in this class, right? It's all about a real world application. So identify a situation or relationship in your real world that you would like to explore applying these 3 dimensions of trust. We suggest that maybe at this point you don't want to start with something like really, really high stakes, like with your boss or something. Like start with something that's just a little bit more, less high stakes. And then we have with this a trust worksheet. I'm just going to show you the prototype. It's not quite ready for each of you to access yet. Shannon will send you an email communication when all this stuff is going to be ready to be pushed out to you. We need to just make copies and stick things in your folders. But essentially is a recap of the kind of things that we talked about. And the nice thing about this worksheet is it literally is a worksheet in which you can kind of circle on a scale of 1 to 10, you know, benevolence, competence, and reliability of yourself, of your perception. So again, a more prescriptive way to practice what we have preached, and then bring those reflections to your buddy meeting. So that's sort of the field work for the buddy call. And then there's the buddy call itself. And the buddy call itself, we have prepared a suggested meeting plan for you guys to use. And we suggest that, that you use probably about 60 to 90 minutes, probably like 90 minutes. The field work is replicated here. You have your buddy pairs. I will make specific copies of this buddy plan for each buddy pair, so you each have your own copy. And it has a meeting plan that already has some suggested process steps in it. So we just did this in order to save you some time. Feel free to modify it and upgrade it as you see fit. So that's the buddy call. So one of the things you're going to have to do after this is get with your buddy and say, hey buddy, when are we going to meet? Sometime in the next 2 weeks. And then finally, because it really is a fantastic video, it's one of my favorite. I've watched it a bajillion times. It's Brene Brown talking about empathy and sympathy. Any questions about anything that I have presented? I'll stop my screen share. Yeah. All good. In that case, you're super early, which is great. Let's go ahead and do a checkout. So the checkout prompt is very similar to the check-in prompt in the sense that it's going to be a round robin, so it's not a conversation. It's just each of us speaking our truth as a way to visually, auditorially, psychologically, emotionally bring our session to a close. And so our checkout prompt for this session is, what thought or feeling is most present for you as we conclude this first session? So whenever you are ready to speak, you can unmute yourself and check out of our time together. Shannon and I will go last.
Readiness for me, just ready to put all of this into practice and see the change that I envision within the organization that I work at. So
Fantastic. Thank you, Cody.
To risk sounding cheesy, I'm feeling very curious now to, you know, apply, but also learn. So I was already eager, but now, you know, you kind of whetted my appetite and I'm ready to go. So.
Excellent. Thank you, Suzanne.
Mm-hmm.
I'll go next. I think probably like a decent amount of excitement. I think this is sort of a weird thing to say, but I mean, I've done some of this kind of work individually, and I am also a big Brene Brown fan. She's awesome. But it's going to be really cool applying it to a work scenario, which I've not done before. And I think probably in teleworking, I felt a little bit like disconnected from everybody. And so this hopefully is going to like maybe bring some of that back and give me some opportunity to dig deep again. It's just kind of been like a numbing experience in general. So this is nice to kind of like reopen some of those feelings.
Thank you, Sarah.
So this is homework I can do. I don't have any anxiety around it. That's my feeling.
I like that. Thank you for that. Shannon.
The most present feeling for me as we conclude is hope. It gives me a lot of hope for the world and for the future to be on a call with 6 other women who want to change the world for the better. And that's a pretty, that's a needed feeling at this present moment in time.
Wow, thanks, Jan. I am checking out feeling grateful. Grateful to the 6 of us being willing to spend the time and prioritizing our attention and our efforts to journeying together. Yeah, I know everybody's super busy and super stressed and stretched in all bajillion ways and kids at home. And so I do not take for granted the priority that we, Shannon and I included, have placed in this time and in this space. So I'm so grateful. And with that, contact us if you have any questions. We will be hearing from us very soon. We are officially adjourned. I've just given you back 12 minutes of your life.
Yay.
Fantastic.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you in a couple weeks. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to meet everybody.
Thanks, y'all.
Nice to meet you all. Bye.
Bye.